Welcome to Cowboy Dusk, where the desert wind carries stories of the Old West that stay with you long after the dust settles. Stories of gunslingers and gentle hearts, of mothers and outlaws, of love forged in fire, and the quiet courage between ordinary people when the world turns against them. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. A woman kneels on a sun-scorched porch, counting flies on her father's blood. 2 bullets took him. 6 men are coming back at dawn to finish what they started. Not just to kill her, but to steal everything 3 generations of her family bled to build. She has half a box of ammunition, no allies, and a dying man's last words she doesn't understand. Under the wooden horse. The only store in town won't sell bullets to a woman. The deputy wears a badge that belongs to the man who murdered her father. And the one stranger willing to help? He's carrying a wanted poster with his own face on it. Tonight dynamite is coming through her windows, and Delilah Ashford has to decide. Will she die fighting alone or do the hardest thing she's ever done? Ask for help? This story reminds us that true strength isn't standing alone. It's having the courage to let others stand beside you, and that the scars we carry don't destroy us. They become part of what holds us up. If that speaks to your soul, ride with us. Hit subscribe, leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Every like helps another lost traveler find this campfire. We'll see you at dusk.
Delilah Ashford counted 3 flies on her father's blood before she realized she had been kneeling on the porch for 15 minutes. The Nevada sun bore down at 102 degrees, pressing against her shoulders like a branding iron held too close. The blood had already begun to darken on the pine boards her grandfather had laid in 1851, boards that had held 3 generations of Ashford boots and never once buckled under the weight. Now they held something they were never meant to hold, and the flies had found it before Delilah's mind had caught up to what her eyes were seeing. She had been 3 miles east, checking cattle in the far pasture when the shots came. 2 sharp cracks that sent the crows screaming out of the cottonwoods along the creek. The sound carried different across the Nevada flats than it did in the hills, flatter, meaner. Like the land itself was too tired to soften the blow. She had pushed copper hard. 15 miles was 15 miles, and a sorrel mare could only run so fast, even one with a heart as big as Copper's. By the time the ranch house came into view, the riders were already gone. Nothing left but dust hanging in the still air and her father on the porch. Thomas Ashford lay on his back with 2 bullets in his chest and the quilt her mother had sewn draped halfway off the rocker where it always sat. His eyes found Delilah's when she dropped to her knees beside him. There was still life in those eyes, but it was fading the way lamplight fades when the oil runs low. "Garrett," he said. The word came out wet. 6 men. Coming back at dawn. "Do not let them take it, Lila." His hand found hers and squeezed with a strength that surprised her. Then he said something that made no sense at all. "Under the wooden horse." "My room." "Papa," Delilah said, "I do not understand." But Thomas Ashford's eyes had already gone still. The hand in hers relaxed. The flies kept buzzing and the Nevada sun kept pressing down, and somewhere in the distance a cow lowed as if nothing in the world had changed. Delilah did not cry. She arranged her father's body with careful hands, straightening his legs, folding his arms across his chest, pulling her mother's quilt over him the way her mother used to pull it over Delilah when she was small. Then she stood and went inside. The house smelled like coffee and gun smoke. Her father's Winchester leaned against the kitchen wall with the action open. She checked the ammunition box on the shelf above the stove and found less than half a box of 44-40 cartridges. Her father had emptied most of his supply shooting back. She would need more before dawn. She went to his bedroom first. The carved wooden rocking horse sat in the corner where it had sat since she was 5 years old. the paint worn thin from her small hands, the mane nothing but a few strands of old yarn. Her father had made it for her the winter after her mother first took sick, carving it from a single piece of pine during the long nights while her mother coughed in the next room. She tipped it over. Nothing. She ran her hands over every surface, checked underneath, behind it, around it. Nothing obvious. The horse was just a horse. She did not have time for puzzles. She memorized her father's words, changed into a cleaner dress, though the blood on the hem of the calico would not come out no matter how much she scrubbed, slung the Winchester over her shoulder, and saddled Copper. On the road to Sloan, the hoofprints told a story. At least 6 horses heading north toward Garrett spread, the tracks deep and confident, men in no hurry. And a 7th set splitting off toward town. Someone from Garrett's bunch had ridden into Sloan ahead of her. She passed the Herrera place at a trot. Elena Herrera was hanging laundry in the side yard, her dark hair pinned up against the heat. Their eyes met across 50 feet of dusty ground. Elena saw the blood on Delilah's dress and her face went white as bleached cotton. She opened her mouth as if to say something, and Delilah saw the words forming, saw the woman's hands tighten on the wet shirt she was holding. Then Elena looked away, went back to the laundry, pinned the shirt to the line with steady hands, and did not look up again. Delilah rode on. Something cold settled in her chest and stayed there. Sloan was a one-street town that had been dying slowly since the silver played out in '79. Miller's General Store sat at the center of the street like a heart that had forgotten how to beat, its false front peeling in the sun, the awning sagging on one end where a post had rotted through. 3 horses stood at the hitching rail. None of them belonged to anyone Delilah knew. She pushed through the front door. The bell above it chimed. Henry Miller looked up from behind the counter with his thick mustache and his nervous hands, and his eyes went straight past Delilah to the far corner of the store where a man sat with his back to the wall and his hat pulled low over his face. Miller swallowed hard enough that Delilah could see his throat move from 10 feet away. His hand went to his apron and began wiping the same spot over and over, the way he always did when he was scared. And Delilah knew. She did not know who was sitting in that corner, but she knew that Henry Miller feared whoever it was more than he feared the woman with a Winchester and blood on her dress. Zachary Donovan had woken up in 4 different towns in the past month and could not remember the name of a single one. Sloan, Nevada would have been the 5th, just another dusty stop on a road that led nowhere he wanted to go, except that the door of the general store swung open and a woman walked in with dried blood on her calico hem and a Winchester across her shoulder, like she had been born carrying it. He was sitting near the front of the store with a cup of coffee in one hand and a coil of rope on the counter beside him. His bay gelding Ranger had thrown a shoe 2 miles outside town, and the farrier could not get to it until tomorrow. That was the only reason he was here. Bad luck with a horseshoe. Or maybe good luck, depending on how you looked at it. His right hand trembled around the coffee cup. It did that every morning, had done it for the better part of 2 years, ever since a night on the Texas border when everything he thought he knew about himself turned out to be wrong. The memory came whether he wanted it or not. A raid on a rustler camp outside Abilene, the dark, the shouting. The muzzle flash like heat lightning, and then a shape rising from behind a wagon, small shape, too small, raising a nickel-plated pistol that caught the moonlight. Zachary's hand was faster than his mind. It always had been. 2 shots. The boy fell. 16 years old, with peach fuzz on his jaw and eyes that stayed open. He still saw those eyes every night he did not drink enough to black them out. The woman with the Winchester walked straight to the counter. Zachary read her the way he used to read men coming into camp, the way she swept the room before speaking, the way her hand never strayed far from the rifle stock, the way she positioned her body to keep the wall at her back. She knew what she was doing with that gun. But her hands were shaking not from fear but from shock. Zachary had seen it in men after firefights, the body catching up to what the mind already knew. "I need 3 boxes of 44-40 ammunition," she said. Her voice was steady, but the hands told the truth. Henry Miller's face went through 3 colors in as many seconds. He cleared his throat twice before answering. "Now, Miss Ashford, I cannot in good conscience sell ammunition to a woman. It would not be proper." The man in the corner shifted his weight. Just barely. A movement so small that most people would have missed it. Zachary did not miss it. He saw the deputy star pinned inside the man's open vest. Jesse Cole, though Zachary did not know the name yet. Cole was watching Miller the way a dog watches a rabbit, waiting to see which way it would run. "My father is dead," the woman said. Her name was Ashford, shot down this morning by Frank Garrett's men. They are coming back tomorrow, and I need to defend my home. Miller's eyes flicked to the corner, to Cole, then back to the woman. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "Truly I am. But I have my policies. Women and ammunition do not mix. Why do you not ride into town and speak with Sheriff Dawson?" "Sheriff Dawson is in Carson City for the week, and you know it," the woman said. Her jaw was clenched so tight Zachary could see the muscles working. "There is no one else." "Then perhaps that is God's way of telling you to let the law handle this matter when the sheriff returns," Miller said, and pushed her money back across the counter. Cole almost smiled, just a thin, satisfied thing that barely moved his mouth, but Zachary caught it and felt something tighten in his jaw. The woman snatched her money and turned for the door. "When they come for your ranches next," she said to the room, "I hope you all remember this moment." The door slammed behind her. Cole stood, tipped his hat to nobody in particular, and walked out the back without a word. Miller slumped against the counter and mopped his forehead with his apron. Zachary sat for a moment looking at the space where the woman had stood. Then he looked through the window and saw her outside, standing with her forehead pressed against her horse's neck. She was not crying. She was just standing there, trembling, her hand on the animal's mane. And something about the image knocked loose a memory he had been carrying for 16 years. His mother, standing outside the First National Bank in Enid, Oklahoma, the day they told her that a woman's signature was not worth the paper it stained. His father had been dead 3 months. His mother had 2 daughters and a 10-year-old son and a ranch that would not run itself. And the bank would not lend her a dime because her husband had the poor judgment to die before paying off his note. Zachary set down his coffee. 3 boxes of 4440, he said to Miller. Miller's hand shook as he put the boxes on the counter. He knew what Zachary was going to do with them. With eyes the color of storm clouds over sage, and a suspicion that was deeper than the day's grief. "What do you want?" she said. "Money? Land? Something else?" Her voice was acid, and Zachary did not blame her for it. The world had given her plenty of reason. "I want to hand you 3 boxes of ammunition," he said. "After that, I will be on my way." He held out the burlap sack. She stared at it, then at him, then back at the sack. She took it, looked inside. 3 boxes, exactly what she had asked for. "Why?" she said. "Because what happened in there was not right," Zachary said, "and I was not raised to stand by when something is not right." He tipped his hat and turned to walk away. He meant it. He was going to walk to the farriers, collect Ranger tomorrow, and ride north until Nevada was a memory. "Hey," the woman called. He turned. "You know how to ride," she said, like she was asking about the weather. "If you are heading north, do not take the main road. Garrett's men are watching it." Then she swung up onto her sorrel mare and rode away, not toward the road that led south to the ranches, toward the town cemetery. Zachary frowned. Where the hell was she going? Then he looked down at his right hand. It was not trembling. For the first time in months, his hand was perfectly still, steady as stone, and he stared at it like it belonged to someone else entirely. Delilah did not visit her mother's grave to pray. She came to apologize for what she was about to do. The Sloan cemetery sat on a low rise east of town where the wind kept the sage trimmed short and the jackrabbits made their burrows between the headstones. Her mother's grave was in the second row, marked by a simple wooden cross that Delilah repainted every spring. Margaret Ashford, beloved wife and mother. 1842 to 1880. Delilah sat in the dirt with her back against the cross and her Winchester across her knees and talked to a woman who had been dead 3 years. "I know what you would say, Mama. You would tell me to find help, to let people in, to stop acting like the whole world is something I have to carry by myself. But there is nobody left to carry it with. Papa is gone. You are gone. And I am not going to sit in that house and wait for them to come finish what they started." The plan had been forming since she found the ammunition. Not defense. Offense. She would ride to Garrett's ranch tonight and hit them before they expected it. 7 men around their campfires, comfortable and confident, celebrating the murder of an old rancher. She would set fire to the stable, scatter their horses, and shoot from the high ground with the Winchester. She had dropped mule deer at 80 yards. Men were bigger targets. It was, by any sane measure, a suicide mission. But Delilah had stopped feeling sane when she counted flies on her father's blood. And if she was going to die, she intended to die with the taste of gunpowder in her mouth and Garrett's men screaming in the dark. "I am sorry, Mama," she said to the cross. "I know you would not want this. But Papa told me to hold the land. And I am going to hold it the only way I know how." She stood, brushed the dust from her dress, and rode south toward Garrett's spread. The sun was getting low, and the shadows of the sage stretched long across the desert floor like dark fingers reaching for something they could not quite touch. She did not know that a man with a trembling hand was watching her leave. Zachary had not intended to follow. He had walked to the farrier's, confirmed that Ranger's shoe would be fixed by morning, and then walked to Ruth Baker's boarding house to eat a meal and sleep in a real bed, before riding north at dawn. Ruth Baker was 63 years old, with a tongue sharp enough to skin a rattlesnake, and eyes that missed nothing. She was a widow who ran the only boarding house in Sloan, a 2-story structure with 4 rooms for let, and a kitchen that smelled like biscuits and strong opinions. She had known everyone in the valley since before the silver boom, and she had outlasted most of them through sheer stubbornness and the ability to keep her mouth shut when it mattered and open it when it mattered more. She set a plate of stew in front of Zachary and sat down across from him without being invited. "You are the one who bought ammunition for the Ashford girl," she said. It was not a question. "Word travels fast," Zachary said. "Word travels fast in a town with 1 street and nothing better to do than watch other people's business." Ruth folded her hands on the table. "Do you know what you have gotten yourself into?" "I have not gotten myself into anything. I bought a woman some cartridges." "That is all?" Ruth studied him for a moment the way a woman studies a horse before deciding whether to buy it. Then she told him everything. Frank Garrett was not just a land-hungry rancher with more ambition than conscience. He was buying up every spread in the valley because the Central Pacific Railroad was surveying a spur line through the territory, and the Ashford property sat on the exact spot where the rail company wanted to build a water station and freight depot. The land that Thomas Ashford had died to protect was worth not hundreds but thousands of dollars, and Garrett meant to own every acre of it before the railroad surveyors arrived in the fall. "That is not all," Ruth said. "The deputy, Jesse Cole, he is Garrett's man. Has been for 2 years. Cole gets 40 acres and a cash payment when the railroad deal goes through. He is the one you should worry about. Garrett sends hired guns. Cole sends warrants." Zachary pushed his stew around the plate. "This is not my fight," he said more to himself than to Ruth. Ruth leaned forward. "That girl is her mother's daughter when it comes to being stubborn, but she is her father's daughter when it comes to being foolish. I loved Margaret Ashford like my own sister, and I watched that woman fight this valley every day of her life with grace and grit and a smile that could stop a train. Her daughter has the grit, but none of the grace. And if somebody does not stop her, she is going to get herself killed, trying to prove she does not need anybody." Ruth paused. "I already sent my nephew to Carson City to find Sheriff Dawson, but Carson City is 2 hard days' ride." Help will not get here before tomorrow night, at the earliest. Zachary sat with that for a long time. The stew grew cold. Outside the window, the sun was dropping behind the western hills and turning the sky the color of old blood. He was going to ride north. He was going to leave this behind the way he had left everything else behind since Texas. He was going to let this be somebody else's problem. Then he thought about Delilah Ashford's eyes, gray as storm clouds and twice as fierce. And he thought about his mother standing outside that bank in Oklahoma with her chin up and her heart breaking, and how a man he never knew had stopped and co-signed the loan for her because he said it was not right that the bank would not lend to a woman on her own. Zachary put on his hat and walked to the livery where Ranger stood with his new shoe freshly fitted. The farrier had finished early. Good luck or Providence. Zachary chose not to decide which. He saddled Ranger and rode out of Sloan, heading south. On the road, he picked up the tracks of a sorrel mare. The hoof prints did not lead toward the Ashford ranch. They led toward Garrett's spread. He stared at the tracks for a full 5 seconds while the truth of them settled over him like a cold wind. She was not going home to defend. She was riding to attack. One woman with 3 boxes of ammunition against 7 men who had killed her father that morning. Jesus Christ, Zachary whispered. She's going to get herself killed. He kicked Ranger into a gallop and ran. The desert turned the color of old blood around him. The sage blurred past. Somewhere ahead of him, a woman with more courage than sense was riding straight into the teeth of the thing that had already taken everything she loved. And Zachary Donovan, who had spent 2 years running from a dead boy's eyes, found himself running towards something for the first time since Texas. Delilah lay belly flat on a rock ledge overlooking Garrett's ranch, counting fires. 7 small blazes scattered across the yard below. 7 men. She had 150 rounds and a plan that any sane person would call a death wish, but Delilah Ashford had not felt sane since she counted flies on her father's blood, and she did not intend to start now. The Garrett spread was larger than the Ashford place by half. A main house of 2 stories with a covered porch, 2 outbuildings used for storage and tack, a stable that held at least 20 horses, and corrals stretching south toward the creek. The men were scattered around their campfires, some playing cards, some drinking. The sound of their voices carrying up through the still evening air, along with the smell of frying meat and tobacco smoke. She found Tommy Fletcher by process of elimination. The youngest among them, maybe 19, sitting apart from the others on an upturned bucket. He was cleaning a rifle with the careful attention of a person who needs something to do with his hands. He did not join the laughter. He did not drink. He just sat and cleaned and occasionally looked up at the main house with an expression that Delilah could not read at this distance. Frank Garrett himself sat on the main house porch in a rocking chair, a cigar glowing between his fingers, maps spread on a small table beside him. Even from 80 yards and in failing light, Delilah could see the control in the way he held himself. No celebration, no gloating. He sat like a man reviewing accounts, which in a way was exactly what he was doing. Then Garrett did something unexpected. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small. He held it in his open palm, staring at it in the firelight with an expression that Delilah had seen only once before on her father's face the night her mother died. It was a child's shoe, tiny, worn, the leather cracked with age. Garrett closed his fingers around it slowly and looked up at the stars for a long moment. Then he put it away and picked up his cigar again, and the moment was gone. Delilah shook it off. Whatever grief lived inside Frank Garrett, it did not change what he had done to her father. Dead was dead. Grief did not grant absolution. Her plan was simple. Set fire to the stable to scatter the horses and create panic, then shoot from the elevated rock ledge while the men scrambled in confusion. The range was good, the angle was good. The Winchester in her hands was the same rifle her father had taught her on when she was 12 years old, and she had not missed a shot since she was 14. She began to move down the slope, keeping low, using the sage and the gathering dark for cover. The stable wall was dry pine baked by a summer of relentless heat. It would catch fast. She reached the back of the stable. The horses inside stamped and blew at the scent of a stranger. She worked quickly, pulling dry brush against the base of the wall, packing it tight. The sage was crisp as paper. She struck a match. The flames caught instantly. Too fast. The brush fire leaped sideways like a living thing, racing along the dry grass that had grown up against the stable wall, and shooting out in a line toward the open desert. The wind, which had been still all evening, chose that exact moment to shift. The fire jumped from the brush to the grass to the slope, racing uphill toward the rock ledge where her rifle and ammunition waited. Below her, men were shouting. Doors slammed. Boots pounded on hard-packed dirt. Someone fired a shot into the darkness, then two more, the muzzle flashes bright as lightning against the darkening sky. Delilah scrambled back toward the ledge, but the fire cut between her and her escape route, a wall of orange and crackling heat that turned the sage into torches. She was trapped between spreading flames and a ranch yard full of armed men who were now shooting at every shadow that moved. A horse came crashing through the scrub from the east. Not one of Garrett's. A bay gelding running hard with a rider who sat the saddle like he had been born there, low and forward and moving with the animal as if they shared the same spine. Zachary Donovan rode straight into the gap between the fire and the shooters, reached down with one hand and caught Delilah's arm. The strength of his grip surprised her. He hauled her up behind him on the bay, and she barely had time to grab his belt before he wheeled the horse and drove it back the way he had come. A bullet chipped the rock face 2 inches from Zachary's head. Another whined past Delilah's ear with the sound of an angry hornet. The bay gelding ran like the devil was behind him, which was close enough to the truth. They cleared the fire line and kept riding north and west through the dark desert, the orange glow shrinking behind them. Delilah turned to look back and saw Garrett's men beating out the brush fire before it reached the stable. They had saved it. She had failed, and Copper was gone. Her sorrel mare had bolted when the fire started, screaming into the darkness with her tail streaming behind her. Delilah could not see her anywhere. They rode for 20 minutes in silence. When Zachary finally slowed the bay to a walk, the silence between them was harder than the ride. "How many were you going to get before they got you?" Zachary said. His voice was cold. 2, 3 maybe. "I had a plan," Delilah said. "You had a funeral with extra steps. Do not you dare. Your father told you to hold the land. Hold it. Not throw your life away on a rock ledge 70 miles from nowhere. If you had died tonight, Garrett would have taken the ranch tomorrow without firing another shot. You would have done his work for him." Delilah opened her mouth to rage at him, to tell him he had no right, that he did not know her, that this was her fight and her land and her father's blood on those porch boards, but the words would not come, because he was right. Her pride had nearly burned everything her father died to protect. Something broke inside her that needed breaking. They reached the Ashford Ranch in silence. The house sat dark against the hillside, the cottonwoods along the creek standing like sentries in the moonlight. Everything looked the same as when she had left it, except that nothing was the same. Delilah climbed down from the bay and walked to the porch. Her father's body lay where she had arranged it, covered by her mother's quilt. But the quilt had been pulled aside at one corner. She knelt and looked closer. Her father's vest pockets were turned inside out. Someone had been here while she was gone. Someone had searched his body. They were looking for something. Under the wooden horse. My room. Garrett's men had been looking for the same thing her father had told her to find with his last breath. Whatever was hidden in that wooden horse, Frank Garrett wanted it back badly enough to send men to search a dead man's pockets. Delilah stood. The decision she was about to make was the hardest of her life, harder than riding to Garrett's ranch, harder than watching the fire turn against her. She turned to face Zachary Donovan, this stranger who had bought her ammunition and pulled her off a burning hillside and spoken the truth to her when everyone else had looked away. "Will you help me?" she said. 3 words, 3 small words that cost her more than any ammunition. She had never said them to anyone. Not to her mother when the consumption was at its worst. Not to her father when the ranch work broke her back. Certainly not to any man. Zachary held her gaze for a long moment. The moonlight caught his eyes and turned them the color of good whiskey. "Yeah," he said. I will. From the darkness to the south, a horse nickered. Copper came limping out of the night, singed and spooked and blowing hard, but alive. She walked straight to the hitching post and stood there with her head down, waiting to be unsaddled. Because this was home, and home was where you went when the world caught fire. Delilah pressed her face against the mare's warm neck and closed her eyes. She did not cry. But she came closer than she had all day. They found it at 2 in the morning. Not under the rocking horse, but inside it. Thomas Ashford had hollowed out the belly of the carved wooden toy and sealed the opening with a plug of pine so perfectly fitted that Delilah had to hold it up to the lamplight before she saw the seam. Zachary used a hunting knife to pry the plug free. Inside the hollow belly was a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the kitchen table and opened it with careful hands. The document inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, the kind used for legal filings and land transfers. It bore the heading Territory of Nevada, Washoe County, and below that the formal language of a deed of sale, transferring ownership of the Ashford Ranch and all its holdings to one Frank W. Garrett for the sum of $50. At the bottom, in black ink, was the signature of Thomas Ashford. Except it was not Thomas Ashford's signature. Delilah knew her father's handwriting the way she knew the shape of his hands. The T was wrong. The loops of the A were too rounded. The slant was off by several degrees. Someone had copied her father's signature from another document and done a passable job of it. But passable was not perfect, and Delilah had spent 22 years watching her father sign receipts and cattle records and letters to her mother's family back east. "This is a forgery," she said. Her voice was flat and hard. There was something else in the box. A letter, folded once, written in her father's actual handwriting. The hand that was unmistakably his. The letters cramped and practical. The ink pressed deep into the paper the way he pressed everything he did into the world around him. Lila. If you are reading this, then things went bad. The paper is Garrett's forgery. He made it up to steal our land through the territorial courts so he would not have to use guns. Ruth helped me get hold of the original before Garrett could file it. Take it to Judge Harlan in Carson City. Do not trust Cole. Do not trust Miller. Trust Ruth. And for God's sake, girl, do not try to handle this alone. Your mother would say the same. I love you. Papa. Delilah read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at Zachary, and for the first time since her father died, her eyes were bright with something other than grief. He did not die because he refused to sell, she said. He died because he had proof. Garrett needs this paperback or his whole scheme falls apart. That is why they searched his body. That is why they are coming back. Zachary picked up the forged deed and held it to the lamplight, studying it with narrowed eyes. This is worth more than ammunition, he said. This is worth a hanging. They worked through the rest of the night preparing the house. Zachary moved with the efficient purpose of a man who had done this before, and Delilah realized that whatever else he was, this drifting cowboy with the trembling hand had experience with violence that went deeper than bar fights and cattle disputes. He directed the fortification with a soldier's eye. Grain sacks filled with dirt to block the windows, stacked 2 deep with a gap between for rifle barrels. A shard of mirror wedged into the corner post of the porch to show the blind spot behind the chicken coop. Rifle loops cut through the log walls of the house at chest height and knee height both, because a man shooting low was harder to spot. Every bucket, pot, and water trough in the place filled to the brim and placed at strategic points inside the house, because fire was the great equalizer and the lesson from the burning brush was fresh. Delilah knew most of this. Her father had taught her. But Zachary added refinements that only came from real experience. Overlapping fields of fire so no approach was uncovered. Furniture arranged not as barricades but as channels, funneling any attacker who breached the door into a killing corridor, an escape route through the root cellar that opened behind the woodpile 30 feet from the house. You have done this before, Delilah said. Zachary did not look up from the sandbag he was filling. 3 years with the Texas Rangers, he said. Company B out of Austin. You are a ranger. Was. I left 2 years ago. The way he said it closed the door on further questions. Delilah let it close. They had more immediate concerns. When the preparations were done, and the house was as fortified as two people could make it, they took their positions in the dark. No lamps. A lit window was a target. They sat in the blackness of the kitchen, each by a window, listening to the Nevada night. The sounds came in layers. Coyotes yipping in the hills above the valley. The creek murmuring its endless conversation with the rocks. Cattle shifting in the corral, their hooves soft on packed earth. A barn owl somewhere in the cottonwoods, hunting with silent wings. "Your hand shakes every morning," Delilah said into the dark. "I have been watching. Why?" It was not a gentle question. Delilah Ashford did not do gentle. She asked things the way she did everything else, head on, with both eyes open. Zachary was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then his voice came out of the darkness, low and rough, like a man pulling a splinter from deep under his skin. "I killed a boy. He was 16 years old. We were raiding a rustler camp outside Abilene. It was dark. There was shooting. A shape came up from behind a wagon. Small shape. Too small. He had a nickel-plated pistol that probably cost more than everything his family owned. He drew on me, and I did not think. I just shot, 2 in the chest. He was dead before he hit the dirt. The darkness between them was absolute. Neither could see the other's face. That was what made it possible." "I was cleared," Zachary continued. "Captain said I did right. The boy drew first. But the next morning his mother came to collect the body. She was about your height. She looked at me and she did not say a word. She did not have to. Silence. Wind against the window glass. Then Delilah spoke. "Thank you for telling me the truth. No judgment, no cheap comfort, no hollow reassurance that it was not his fault or that he did what he had to do. Just the acknowledgement that he had trusted her with something that was eating him alive, and that the trust itself was worth something." In the quiet that followed, Delilah said the things she had not said to anyone. "I was not here when they shot him. I was 3 miles east counting cattle in the far pasture. I heard the shots. I rode as hard as I could. Took me 20 minutes. Her voice cracked on the number. 20 minutes. He died because I was 20 minutes away." Zachary's voice came back steady and without hesitation. "If you had been here, you would be dead beside him, and Garrett would have the deed and the forgery, and nobody would ever know the truth." It did not erase the guilt, but it shifted the angle just enough that she could draw a full breath for the first time since that morning. A noise outside, scraping, shuffling, something moving along the side of the house. They both raised weapons instantly, moving with the silent coordination of people whose lives depend on each other. Zachary pointed. Delilah nodded. She went to the back door, twisted the handle, and threw it open with the Winchester leveled. A coyote crouched 3 feet from the chicken coop with a dead hen in its jaws. It stared at Delilah with yellow eyes that caught the starlight. She stared back. Woman and animal, both wild-eyed, both running on instinct. The coyote dropped the chicken and bolted into the sage. Delilah stood in the doorway with her heart slamming against her ribs and the absurd urge to laugh. She did not laugh. She shut the door and went back to her window. "False alarm," she said. Zachary let out a breath that was almost a laugh itself. "I nearly shot a chicken thief." That would have been hard to explain. The adrenaline faded. In its wake came a strange intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. 2 people in the dark, trusting each other enough to close their eyes. "You should sleep," Zachary said. "I will take first watch." "I am not tired. You are exhausted. Your father died this morning. You rode 30 miles, tried to burn down a ranch, nearly got yourself killed, and spent 3 hours filling sandbags. Sleep while you can. I have not slept right in 2 years. Might as well make use of it." She wanted to argue. Instead, she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, lay on top of the covers in her clothes with the Winchester beside her, and was asleep within a minute. She woke to Zachary's hand on her shoulder. The room was still dark, but the quality of the darkness had changed. the deep black of midnight giving way to the gray that came before dawn. Zachary's face was grim. "Come downstairs," he said, quietly. She followed him to the kitchen window. He pointed north toward the ridge above the ranch, a dark line against the slowly lightening sky. "Watch," he said. A flash of light. Brief, sharp, then another, and another. Not fire, not stars. Mirror light. Someone on the ridge was sending heliograph signals toward Garrett's ranch. "They know we are here," Zachary said. "And they know there are two of us. They have been watching since we got back last night." Delilah felt the cold settle back into her chest. The attack was not just coming. It was being coordinated, and it would come from more than one direction. They came when the sun cleared the stable roof. Not 7 riders like Delilah had counted the night before. 9. Garrett had called in reinforcements, and the 9th man wore a badge. Delilah watched them through the rifle loop Zachary had cut in the front wall, her cheek against the stock of the Winchester, her breathing slow and controlled. The riders came at an easy walk, spread out in a line that said they had done this kind of thing before. In the center, Frank Garrett sat his black horse with the bearing of a man who had never been told no and believed in it. To his right rode Jesse Cole, his deputy star polished bright enough to catch the morning sun. He had a holstered revolver and a rolled paper in his hand. Zachary was at the side window, her father's Henry rifle across his lap. His face was calm, but Delilah could see his right hand flexing and relaxing, as if trying to convince itself to behave. Garrett stopped his line 50 yards from the house, close enough to shout, far enough to be hard to hit. He knew the distance. "Miss Ashford," Garrett called. His voice carried clean across the morning air. "Your father stole something that belongs to me. Hand over the paper and you can keep this worthless ranch until the bank takes it. I will even let your cowboy friend ride out in one piece." Delilah looked at Zachary. He shook his head once. If they gave up the forged deed, they gave up the only evidence that Garrett had committed crime serious enough for a hanging. And once that paper was gone, they would be gone too. No witnesses. "We fight," Delilah said. "We fight," Zachary said. Garrett waited. The silence stretched. Then Garrett raised one hand and 2 riders peeled off from the line and began circling toward the east side of the house. The first shot came from Delilah's Winchester. The rider on the left jerked sideways as the bullet punched through the meat of his thigh. His horse reared and he fell, hitting the ground hard, crawling for a rock that was not big enough to cover him. The sound of the shot rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Zachary fired next. His first shot was clean, kicking up dirt a foot from the second rider's horse and turning the animal sideways. His second shot was better, catching the man's saddle horn and sending splinters into his face. But on the third shot, Zachary's hand trembled. The bullet went wide by 2 feet. Zachary froze. Delilah glanced over and saw something she had not expected. His eyes had gone distant, unfocused, looking at something that was not in this room or this valley or this year. The dead boy in Texas, staring up at him from the dirt with open eyes. "Zachary," Delilah said, sharp, commanding, like snapping a whip. He came back, blinked, fired again. This time he did not miss. But Delilah had seen the fracture. She was depending on a man at war with himself, and for the first time she understood that Zachary Donovan's trembling hand was not a physical problem. It was a moral one. And moral problems did not heal like bullet wounds. The battle settled into a rhythm. Garrett's men probed and retreated, testing the defenses, looking for weak spots. Zachary and Delilah answered every probe with careful, measured fire, making every round count. They could not afford to waste ammunition. The morning wore on. The sun climbed. The temperature inside the house rose until sweat ran down Delilah's face and dripped off her chin onto the rifle stock. She drank water from a bucket by her knee and kept shooting. At midday, smoke began to rise from behind the house. 2 of Garrett's men had circled wide and reached the stable from the blind side where the mirror shard could not see. Flames licked up the dry pine walls and caught the roof in seconds. Delilah heard the crack of timbers, smelled the smoke, felt the heat pressing through the back wall of the house. Her grandfather had built that stable in 1853. With wood he hauled from the mountains himself. She had taken her first steps holding onto the stall door where Copper's mother lived. Every memory she had of learning to ride began in that stable. She held her position. The stable burned. She did not break. Zachary saw the horses first. Copper and Ranger were in the small corral adjacent to the stable, and the fire was spreading toward the fence rails. Both animals were screaming, running the perimeter, slamming against the posts. Another minute and the fence would catch and they would burn. Zachary did not decide. His body decided for him. He was out the back door and running before Delilah could shout his name, sprinting across open ground while bullets cracked past him like angry hornets. He reached the corral gate, threw the latch, and the horses stampeded out, Copper and Ranger and the mule that nobody had remembered to count. A bullet caught Zachary along the left side of his ribs. It did not go in, but it opened a gash as long as his hand and deep enough that he could feel the air against muscles that were never meant to see daylight. He pressed his arm against the wound and staggered back to the house while blood soaked through his shirt and ran between his fingers. The stable collapsed behind him with a sound like the earth swallowing itself whole. Sparks flew up in a column that was visible for miles. Delilah pulled him inside and pressed a folded cloth against the wound. "We can rebuild a stable," she said. Zachary looked at her with something like wonder. That was what he had been going to say. The afternoon brought something worse than bullets. Jesse Cole rode up to the front of the house alone, his badge catching the sunlight, a rolled paper held high in his right hand. He came at a walk, deliberate and unhurried, and stopped 30 yards from the porch. "Delilah Ashford," Cole called. "I am Deputy Sheriff Jesse Cole, and I am holding a warrant for your arrest on the charge of murder. You are accused of killing one Samuel Briggs, employee of the Garrett Ranch, on this day of June, 1883. You are ordered to surrender your weapons and come with me peacefully." Delilah's blood went cold. The man she had shot in the thigh that morning. She had seen him crawl to cover, alive. He was not dead. "He is not dead," she said to Zachary. "Does not matter," Zachary said through clenched teeth, holding the cloth against his side. "The warrant is the weapon. If you resist a deputy, you are a fugitive. Garrett takes the ranch through the courts with Cole as his witness." The trap within the trap. Garrett had not come just with guns. He had come with the law itself, bent and twisted to serve his purpose. Zachary stood. He walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch with his hands raised and no weapon in them. Blood was soaking through his shirt, and he swayed once on his feet, but he did not fall. "My name is Zachary Donovan," he said. His voice carried across the yard, loud enough for every one of Garrett's men to hear. "I served 3 years with the Texas Rangers out of Company B, Austin, badge number 471. I was honorably discharged. Any action you take here today will be sworn testimony before a territorial judge when Sheriff Dawson returns. You want to serve that warrant, Deputy Cole, you had better be damn sure it holds up under oath, because I promise you, mine will." Cole stared at him. The confidence on his face shifted not to fear but to calculation. He had not known about the Rangers. A Texas Ranger's testimony, even a former one, carried weight that could make a territorial judge look very hard at a deputy's paperwork. "I will return with proper authority from Carson City," Cole said. He turned his horse and rode back to Garrett's line. Garrett's face was a storm. Cole's retreat stripped away the legal leverage that was supposed to make this clean and simple. He pulled his men back, but before he went, he pointed at the house and spoke loud enough to be heard through the broken windows. "Tonight, Miss Ashford, when it is dark and there are no witnesses and your ranger friend is bleeding out on your floor, I will finish this." The riders wheeled and rode north. Dust settled behind them. As the last rider disappeared over the rise, old Ben Rawlins came riding from the south on a sway-backed roan, breathless and red-faced. "I saw riders on the Carson City Road," he shouted. "Looked like a column, maybe lawmen. Could be Dawson coming back early." For 10 minutes, Delilah let herself hope. She stood on the porch with her father's blood still staining the boards beneath her feet. and she let herself believe that help was coming, that the cavalry would arrive, that she would not have to survive another night. Then Will Rawlins galloped in behind his father on a lathered horse. "It is not Dawson," he said. "Just a mule train headed for the silver mines up north. No lawmen. Nobody." The hope collapsed. It fell through her like a stone through water and settled somewhere deep and cold. Zachary sagged against the door frame. The cloth against his side was soaked through. His face was the color of old ash. "Do not you die on me," Delilah said. Her voice came out raw and fierce and close to breaking. "That is an order, Donovan." He managed a grin that was more grimace than smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And his eyes lost focus and his knees buckled, and Delilah caught him before he hit the floor. He was heavier than she expected. She dragged him to the kitchen, laid him on the table, and cut his shirt away from the wound. The gash was long and ugly and still bleeding. She needed to stop the bleeding before anything else. She needed supplies and help and time, and she had none of those things. Night was coming, and with it, Frank Garrett and his dynamite. Delilah had 6 hours before dark. A man bleeding on her kitchen floor, and not a single soul in Sloan who had looked her in the eyes since her father died. She was going to have to save herself. But this time she would do it her mother's way. She dressed Zachary's wound as best she could with clean cloth and whiskey for antiseptic. He hissed through his teeth when the whiskey hit the raw flesh, but he did not cry out. His eyes were glassy, but present. "I have to go into town," she said. He tried to sit up. "I will come. You will lay still and keep pressure on that wound, or I will tie you to this table. I am not losing you, too." The words came out before she could stop them. Too honest, too raw, too much of what she was feeling laid bare. Zachary looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them named. "Go," he said. "I will be here when you get back." She rode Copper into Sloan at a run. The mare was limping slightly from the night before, singed hair still visible on her left flank, but she was game for the ride, and Delilah loved her for it. She did not go to Miller's General Store. She went straight to Ruth Baker's boarding house and pushed through the front door without knocking. Ruth was in the kitchen rolling biscuits. She looked up, saw Delilah's face, and set down the rolling pin. "Sit down," Ruth said. "I do not have time to sit down. Garrett is coming back tonight. Zachary is hurt. Cole has a warrant, and they want the forgery." Ruth nodded as if none of this was news. "My nephew left for Carson City yesterday afternoon. Dawson is on his way, but 2 days at the earliest. We need to get through tonight." "We," Delilah said. "We." Ruth untied her apron and hung it on the hook. "I have been talking to people. The Rawlins family. The Herreras. Tomas Herrera lost his land to Garrett the same way your father almost lost his. Elena has been working here at the boarding house since they sold. Ben Rawlins lost his barn to arson last winter, and everybody knows who did it, even if nobody can prove it. They will not stand up on their own. Nobody wants to be the first. But if somebody leads..." Delilah stared at her. "You have been planning this." "I have been waiting for someone to give me a reason." Ruth's eyes were bright and hard. "Your mother was my dearest friend, and I did nothing while Garrett squeezed your father for 3 months. That is on my conscience, and it will stay there. But I will be damned if I sit here rolling biscuits while they finish what they started." Delilah went to each family. She did not give speeches. She did not make promises. She sat at kitchen tables and told the truth. The Herrera house was the hardest. Tomas Herrera sat with his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, staring at the table. He would not look at Delilah. His wife Elena stood by the stove with her arms crossed and her dark eyes burning. "He is coming for me tonight," Delilah said. "After me, it is whoever he wants next. You already lost your land, Tomas. I am asking you to help me make sure nobody else does." Tomas shook his head slowly. "I got a wife, Miss Ashford. I cannot risk." Elena Herrera moved. She walked to the wall where an old Sharps rifle hung above the door, lifted it down, and held it out to her husband. Her father's rifle, heavy and scarred and decades old. "If you will not go," she said, "I will. Give me the horse." Tomas looked at his wife for a long time. The silence in that kitchen was a living thing. Then he took the rifle from her hands and stood up from the table without a word. Ben Rollins agreed before Delilah finished her second sentence. The old man had been waiting for someone to ask. His son Will came without being asked at all. He was already saddling his horse when Delilah rode up, having heard from Ruth. 4 volunteers, an old rancher with a grudge, a blacksmith with strong arms, a farmer with his wife's fire in his belly, and a sharp-tongued boarding-house widow who had finally found her courage. They were not gunfighters. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary people who had had enough. As Delilah rode out of town with the men behind her, Henry Miller ran out of his store into the street. His face was gray and his hands were shaking worse than Zachary's. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Wait." He pushed 2 more boxes of ammunition into her hands. 4440. "Brand new. Your father loaned me $200.79 when I nearly lost this store," Miller said. "I never paid him back proper. This does not square it, but..." He could not finish. Delilah took the ammunition. She looked at this man who had turned her away when she needed him most. This coward wrapped in propriety who had hidden behind his apron while her world burned. She saw the shame in his eyes and recognized it because she had seen the same shame in her own reflection. She nodded once. That was all. It was enough. Miller stood in the street watching them ride south. The sun was getting low. He had 4 hours to decide what kind of man he wanted to be for the rest of his life. The ammunition was a start. They reached the ranch at a hard trot. Zachary was sitting up at the kitchen table with the wound rebandaged in clean cloth, his face pale but his eyes clear. He had used the time to check every weapon in the house and lay them out in order on the kitchen table. 3 rifles, 2 shotguns, 4 revolvers, and now 5 boxes of ammunition thanks to Miller. When he saw Delilah come through the door with 4 armed men behind her, something shifted in his face. A look she had not seen before, not surprise, not relief, something deeper. "You asked for help," he said. "Mama would have been proud," Delilah said. "I am proud," Zachary said. She did not know what to do with that, so she started unloading ammunition. While organizing supplies, she reached into Zachary's saddlebag looking for the clean bandages she had seen him pack. Her hand found something flat and folded instead. She pulled it out, a wanted poster. Old, creased from being folded and refolded many times. The drawing was rough but recognizable. A man with dark hair to his shoulders and a strong jaw, and eyes that looked out from the cheap paper, with an intensity that was hard to capture in ink. The text below it read, "Wanted for murder. Zachary Donovan, Abilene, Texas." There was more text beneath, but the paper was torn and she could only read fragments. "Shooting death of minor." Her blood went cold. She looked across the room at the man on her kitchen floor. The man she had trusted with her life. The man she was beginning to feel things for that she could not name and did not want to examine. She folded the poster and put it in her pocket. She said nothing. But when she handed Zachary a cup of water, she did not let her fingers brush his the way she had done without thinking an hour ago. Zachary noticed the absence. He did not know why. The sun was touching the western hills when Tommy Fletcher appeared at the edge of the property. He came on foot, alone, hands raised above his head, walking slow and careful like a man who understood that the wrong step would get him killed. He was carrying something in his left hand, something that caught the last of the daylight and threw it back in a dull gleam. "Do not shoot," Tommy called. His voice cracked on the words. He was 19 years old and scared to the bone. "Please, I have news. Garrett is bringing dynamite." He set down the object he was carrying. Delilah saw it from the porch and her throat closed up. It was her father's revolver. Thomas Ashford's Colt .44, the same gun he had carried for 30 years. The same gun that had been in his holster when Garrett's men shot him down. Garrett had taken it from his body as a trophy. Tommy Fletcher had brought it back. Delilah walked down from the porch and picked up her father's gun. It was still loaded. 2 rounds her father never got to fire. The grip was warm from Tommy's hand, But underneath she could feel the shape that was as familiar as her own pulse. She looked up at the boy. He was shaking. His lip was split, and there was a bruise on his cheek that was fresh enough to still be darkening. "Come inside," Delilah said. Tommy Fletcher sat at the kitchen table where 36 hours ago the man he had followed like a father had ordered the death of the man whose daughter now pointed a rifle at his chest. He was 19 years old, and his hands shook worse than Zachary Donovan's had ever shook. "Talk," Delilah said. "Garrett has 3 sticks of dynamite. Took them from the Consolidated Silver Mine 12 miles north. It has been abandoned since '78. He has been keeping them in his tack room wrapped in oilcloth. The plan is to come after full dark, throw the dynamite through the windows, and finish whoever comes out." "Where did you get that bruise?" Zachary said from his chair by the wall. Tommy touched his split lip and winced. "I asked him if we really needed dynamite for one woman. He hit me in front of everybody, called me soft, said my mother was a whore and that is why she left me at the orphanage." The boy's voice went flat, empty, like a jar turned upside down and drained. "My mother did not leave me," Tommy said. "She died having me. He knew that. He has always known that." The room was quiet. Ben Rollins shifted in his chair. Will Rollins looked at the floor. Tomas Herrera looked at Tommy Fletcher and saw something he recognized, a young man who had followed the wrong man for the right reasons. "Why should we believe you?" Delilah said. "I brought your father's gun," Tommy said. "Garrett kept it on his mantle like a trophy. I took it when nobody was watching, and I walked 8 miles to bring it here because I thought you ought to have it back." Zachary questioned him for 20 minutes. Careful questions, precise, the kind of questions a man asks when he's been trained to find the lie in any story. How many men? Which direction? What time? What weapons beyond the dynamite? Where was Garrett when Tommy left? Who was watching the South approach? Tommy answered every question without contradiction. His story held. Then Delilah pulled Zachary aside. The others watched with the careful attention of people who know something is happening but are too polite or too smart to ask what. Delilah took the wanted poster from her pocket and held it up where only Zachary could see it. "Explain this," she said. "Now." The color drained from Zachary's face. Not the color of guilt. The color of a man who sees a moment he has dreaded arriving exactly when he can least afford it. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Your saddlebag." "I was looking for bandages. Start talking or you can take your horse and go." Zachary looked at the poster in her hand, his own face staring back at him from cheap paper. The worst moment of his life reduced to 2 words and a drawing. He told her everything. The raid, the dark, the boy behind the wagon, the nickel-plated pistol, the 2 shots and the body on the ground and the mother who came the next morning to collect her son. "The poster was put out by the boy's father," Zachary said. "A rancher with enough money to print handbills but not enough evidence for a real warrant. The Rangers investigated. I was cleared of all charges. The captain wrote it up as justified use of force, and the territorial judge in Austin upheld it." "Then why do you carry it?" Delilah said. "Because I deserve to carry it. That poster is the truest thing anyone has ever written about me. I killed a boy. No piece of paper from Austin changes that." Delilah stared at him in the lamplight. The bruised, bleeding, exhausted man who had bought her ammunition from a store that would not sell to her, who had pulled her off a burning hillside, who had stood on her porch and faced down a corrupt deputy with nothing but his name and his record. "You could have lied," she said. "I could have. You probably never would have known. Then why did you not? Because you asked me for the truth the night you asked me to stay. I figured that deal runs both ways. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness because there was nothing to forgive, and not absolution because neither of them had the right to grant it. It was recognition, the recognition that they were both carrying deaths they could not prevent and that neither of them had to carry them alone." Delilah put the poster back in his saddlebag. "Do not lose that," she said. "You might need it someday to prove to yourself how far you have come." That was all she said. It was enough. While Delilah went back inside to brief the others on the new plan, Zachary stepped out into the dark. He leaned against the corral fence and tipped his head back and looked at the stars. and face the thing that had been eating him since the firefight that morning. He wanted to be here, but not only for the right reasons. Part of him, the part that drank to sleep and kept a dead boy's face behind his eyes, wanted this fight because he was looking for a way to die that felt meaningful. He had been using Delilah's battle the way he used to use whiskey, to numb the thing inside him that would not stop screaming. He was not a hero. He was a man looking for a grave that came with a clear conscience. He looked at Ranger, saddled and standing patient in the dark. He could ride, right now, leave the fight to the people who actually belonged here. Nobody would follow him. Nobody would blame him. He would just be another drifter who drifted away. His hand was on the saddle horn when he heard Delilah's voice through the open kitchen window. She was explaining Fields of Fire to Ben Rawlins, a 60-year-old man holding a rifle he had not fired in a decade. And she was speaking to him with the calm authority of a commanding officer briefing her troops. She did not look outside. She did not call Zachary's name. She did not ask him to stay. She did not need him to stay. And that was what made him take his hand off the saddle. Not obligation, not guilt, not the desperate hunger for redemption that had driven him for 2 years. Something simpler and more terrifying than any of those things. He wanted to live, not to die nobly in a blaze of gunfire that would look good in a dime novel. He wanted to be alive tomorrow morning in this valley, near this woman who had seen the worst thing he had ever done and had not turned away. He went back inside, picked up his rifle, took his position. They could not defend from inside the house, not with dynamite in play. Zachary spread the defenders across the terrain outside. Delilah at the rock outcrop behind the house, high ground with clear sight lines. Zachary at the creek bed, covering the north approach. Ben Rawlins behind the cottonwood line where he could see the road. Will Rawlins at the corral fence, the closest position to the house. Tomas Herrera prone in the garden rows, Elena's Sharp's rifle solid against his shoulder. Tommy Fletcher inside the house, unarmed, tasked with keeping the lamps dark and watching the windows. They waited. The moon was a thin crescent, enough to see shapes, but not faces. The desert went quiet in the way that deserts go quiet when something is about to happen, as if the land itself holds its breath. Garrett came at midnight. 6 riders. He had lost men to injury and desertion since the morning, and the ones who remained were the hardcore, the true believers. The ones who had been with Garrett long enough to have blood on their hands that would not wash off. They came from the north at a walk, leading their horses to muffle the hoofbeats, dark shapes against a darker sky. One of them carried something bundled against his chest. The dynamite. Zachary let them come. 50 yards, 40, 30. He could hear their saddle leather creaking, could smell the horses, could see the faint orange glow of a cigar that someone had been too stupid to put out. He fired the signal shot. The night exploded. Muzzle flash from 5 positions at once, brief bright blooms of orange in the darkness. Garrett's men scattered. Horses screamed. The man with the cigar went down first, his horse bolting, dragging him 30 feet with his boot caught in the stirrup before the leather gave way. Ben Rawlins fired from the cottonwood line with the steady deliberation of a man who had been waiting a long time for this. His first shot unhorsed a rider. His second drove another behind a water trough. "Garrett burned my barn," the old man said to no one in particular. "I remember every face that rode with him. Tomas Herrera fired Elena's Sharps, and the recoil nearly knocked him flat. But the heavy slug caught a rider in the shoulder and spun him out of the saddle. Tomas let out a yell that was half rage and half release, the sound of a man finally fighting back against the thing that had been crushing him. Will Rawlins held the corral side. Nobody got past him. In the chaos, one of Garrett's men broke through the perimeter. He rolled off his horse and crawled through the sage toward the house, staying low, moving fast. In his hand was a stick of dynamite with a short fuse. He struck a match. The fuse sputtered and caught. Zachary saw the spark from the creek bed, 40 feet between the man and the house where Tommy Fletcher was hiding. Zachary could shoot the man from here, easy shot. The man was lit up by his own fuse, a perfect target silhouetted against the dark. But the dynamite was already lit. If Zachary shot the man, the dynamite would fall where it fell. Maybe close enough to the house to bring down a wall. Maybe close enough to kill Tommy Fletcher, a 19-year-old boy who had walked 8 miles to bring back a dead man's gun because it was the right thing to do. Zachary could shoot the man and be safe. Or he could run. He once killed a boy. The memory of it had broken something in him that 2 years of drifting and drinking had not fixed. But now, in this moment, with a lit fuse hissing in the dark, he saw the choice clearly for the first time. He ran, 30 feet across open ground, bullets cracking past him, his wounded side screaming with every stride. He hit the man at full run, tackled him, wrenched the dynamite from his fist, and threw it as hard and as far as he could into the open dirt beyond the corral. The explosion turned night to noon. A column of dirt and rock and fire erupted from the ground, and the shockwave hit Zachary like a wall, lifting him off his feet and slamming him down. His ears rang. His vision went white. The man beneath him had gone limp. Delilah saw the explosion from the rock outcrop. She saw Zachary run. She saw him throw the dynamite. She saw the blast pick him up and put him down, and she thought with a cold certainty that reached into every corner of her being that he was dead. She stood up. She stepped out from behind the rock into the fading light of the explosion with the Winchester at her shoulder, and she fired 3 shots in succession. Clean, precise, devastating. 2 men went down. The 3rd round punched through a saddle and sent the horse underneath it, bolting into the dark. This was Delilah Ashford at her apex. Not the reckless woman who had set fire to a hillside 2 nights ago. Not the proud woman who would not ask for help. This was something else entirely. Controlled fury with purpose. Every shot placed where it needed to go. No wasted rounds, no wasted rage. Frank Garrett saw his force crumble. His men were down or running, and the night was full of gunfire from positions he had not expected. He wheeled his horse and drove it south, leaning forward in the saddle, running. Delilah tracked him with the Winchester. 60 yards, moonlight, moving target on horseback. She led the shot the way her father had taught her, adjusted for the horse's gait, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit the horse in the hind quarter. The animal screamed, a terrible sound, and went down. Garrett flew from the saddle and hit the ground hard. His leg was pinned beneath the thrashing horse. Delilah walked toward him. Across the open ground, through the smell of dynamite and gunpowder and burning sage, past the bodies and the broken things, the Winchester in her hands steady as the ground beneath her feet. Garrett looked up at her, blood on his face, leg bent at the wrong angle. His hand moved toward his belt, where a revolver still sat in its holster, and Delilah put the Winchester's muzzle 3 inches from his forehead. "Don't," she said. His hand stopped. He looked at her with those cold, pragmatic eyes that had calculated the value of her father's life, and found it less than the price of a railroad spur. "Do it," he said. "Your father would have." Delilah thought about the child's shoe in his vest pocket. She thought about the way grief can turn a person into something they do not recognize. And she thought about a rock ledge 2 nights ago where she had been willing to die to prove she did not need anyone. "My father taught me a lot of things," she said. But the most important one was knowing when not to pull the trigger. She turned her back on him. The most dangerous thing she had ever done. You do not turn your back on a wounded animal. But Garrett did not reach for his gun. He lay in the dirt with his broken leg and his dead horse and his ruined empire, and watched her walk away, and whatever was left inside him was not enough to make him pull the trigger. Delilah ran to the blast crater where Zachary lay motionless. She dropped to her knees. His face was scorched. His shirt was torn. Blood was everywhere. Old blood and new blood mixed together until she could not tell where one wound ended and another began. She put her hand on his chest. His heart was beating, strong, stubborn, alive. "Zachary," she whispered, "your hand is not shaking." His eyes opened. He looked at her, dark eyes in a scorched face, and behind the pain and the exhaustion and the ringing in his ears, something had changed. Something that had been broken for 2 years had finally found its way back together. "First time in 2 years," he said. She did not kiss him. She pressed her forehead against his and breathed, just breathed. The smell of gunpowder and blood and sage, and underneath all of it, the warm, alive scent of him, heartbeat against her palm, breath against her face, alive, alive, alive. It was enough. It was more than enough. Around them the night went quiet. The shooting stopped. Somewhere in the darkness, Ben Rawlins was calling out that the last of Garrett's men had fled. Will Rawlins was tending to a graze on his father's arm. Tomas Herrera was sitting in the garden rows with Elena's sharps across his knees, staring at nothing, breathing hard. Tommy Fletcher stood in the doorway of the house, unhurt, looking out at the aftermath with the expression of a boy who has just watched the world rearrange itself into a shape he did not expect. It was over. The hardest part was not the battle. The hardest part was the morning after, when the adrenaline drained out and left nothing but damage and the long, slow work of putting a life back together. Zachary's injuries were worse in daylight. Cracked ribs from the blast, the gash in his side reopened and bleeding through every bandage they put on it. Flash burns on his hands and the left side of his face. His left ear rang constantly and he could not hear anything from that side. Delilah stitched the wound with a sewing needle and whiskey. She had done it before on cattle and once on her own forearm when a wire caught her during branding season, but she had never done it on a man who was looking at her the whole time with eyes that said more than either of them was ready to speak out loud. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table until his knuckles went white, and he made a sound through his teeth that she would hear in her sleep for weeks afterward. She apologized with every stitch. He told her to stop apologizing and keep sewing. She told him to shut up and hold still. 2 days later, Sheriff Dawson rode in with 3 deputies and a face like a thundercloud. He was a solid man in his 50s, honest to the marrow, and the fact that his town had nearly been destroyed while he was away on legitimate business in Carson City ate at him in a way that showed in the set of his jaw and the way he took every statement with the meticulous fury of a man determined to get this right. He interviewed everyone: Delilah, Zachary, Tommy Fletcher, Ben Rawlins, Will, Tomas Herrera, Ruth Baker, who had not been present at the battle but who had enough knowledge of Garrett's operations to fill in the gaps that the others could not. Jesse Cole was arrested the same night Dawson arrived. A deputy found him at the sheriff's office at 3 in the morning, feeding documents into the pot-bellied stove. Among the papers Dawson recovered before they burned were 3 additional forged deeds. 3 families besides the Ashfords whose land Garrett had stolen through fraudulent documents filed with the territorial court: the Rawlins place, the Herrera property. 2 other families who had moved away years ago believing they had sold willingly, when in fact they had never signed anything at all. Garrett's scheme was bigger than anyone had known. He was not just taking one ranch. He was assembling an entire valley to sell to the railroad, and the paper trail proved every bit of it. Delilah handed over the forged deed from the tin box, the one her father had hidden inside a wooden rocking horse with a pine plug so perfectly fitted that only a man who had built the horse with his own hands could have concealed it. The document that Thomas Ashford had died to protect. Garrett was taken into custody and transported to Carson City under guard. The charges were murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and land theft. The territorial judge set the trial for September. The evidence, combined with testimony from 6 witnesses and a former Texas Ranger, was enough to put Frank Garrett inside the Nevada Territorial Prison in Carson City for the rest of his natural life. Jesse Cole faced charges as accessory to murder and abuse of his office. He would likely see the same stone walls. As the deputies loaded Garrett into the transport wagon, he passed within 3 feet of Delilah. He stopped, looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes. "You are like him," Garrett said. Delilah did not answer. She did not need to. They both knew he was not talking about her father. They buried Thomas Ashford on the hillside above the ranch, beneath the old cottonwood that had been there since before the Ashfords arrived. Delilah had her mother's remains moved from the town cemetery to lie beside him, family together again, on the land they had loved. The grave was dug in silence. Zachary helped despite his injuries, leaning on the shovel handle between strokes, breathing hard, refusing to sit down when Delilah told him to rest. The sound of the blade cutting earth was the only sound for a long time. Sweat fell from Delilah's jaw onto the turned soil. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves and threw moving shadows across the grave. Copper stood nearby with her ears forward, as if listening. When it was done, Delilah placed her father's Winchester on the mound of fresh dirt. She stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then she picked it up again. She was not done with it yet. A week after the battle, Zachary was healed enough to sit on the porch. The evening light lay across the valley like a blessing, turning the sage gold and the creek to silver. The cattle grazed in the far pasture. The blackened ruin of the stable was the only mark of what had happened here. And already, Delilah had drawn plans for a new one. Zachary sat in her father's rocking chair with his bandaged hands resting on the arms and his eyes on the valley. "I should go when this heals up," he said. Delilah sat in the chair beside him. Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. "You should. But if you wanted to stay, I have got work that needs doing. 50-50 partnership. Split the profits when we sell the cattle in fall." "Partners," Zachary said. "Just partners," Delilah said. He looked at her. The evening light caught her eyes and turned them silver. "We start there," he said. No kiss, no declaration. Two damaged people sitting on a porch, looking at a valley they had nearly died to keep. Both of them carrying scars that would never fully heal. Both of them knowing that the hardest part was not the battle, but the building that came after. It was enough. It was more than enough. 10 years later, Delilah Donovan stood on the exact spot where Henry Miller had refused to sell her ammunition, except that now the building bore the sign Ashford Donovan Mercantile, and she owned every nail in it. The store was open and busy with the mid-morning trade. Thomas Donovan, 8 years old, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, was chasing his little sister Sarah through the aisles, while Zachary tried to stock shelves one-handed because Sarah had claimed his other hand for horseback rides, and she was not a child who took no for an answer. A sign hung on the wall behind the counter, hand-painted in Delilah's careful script. "We sell to everyone, no exceptions." Tommy Fletcher pushed through the front door wearing a deputy's star and the easy confidence of a man who had found his proper place in the world. "Morning," he said. "Coffee on." "Always is," Delilah said. "Help yourself." Tommy poured a cup and leaned against the counter. "Sheriff Dawson says the railroad wants to renegotiate the water rights for the spur line. They are offering 12% above last year. Tell Dawson I will have the cooperatives answer by Friday," Delilah said. "And tell them if they want better than 12, they can talk to me directly instead of going through the sheriff's office." Tommy grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Ben Rollins came in for fence wire. Tomas and Elena Herrera stopped by with eggs from the farm they had gotten back after the trial. The valley had recovered. The railroad came through eventually, as railroads do. But they dealt with the cooperative that Delilah had organized rather than a single landowner, and every family in the valley got a fair price for their water rights and easement access. Delilah watched Zachary swing Sarah up onto his shoulders while Thomas tugged at his belt, asking to be next. The morning light caught the scars on Zachary's hands, the ones from the dynamite, pale against his tan skin. He wore them the way he wore everything, without apology, without shame, as marks of a night when he chose to live instead of die. The memory came without warning, the way they always did. 6 months after the battle. The new stable was half built, the frame up and the roof going on board by board. Zachary was standing below a crossbeam, holding up a nail. Delilah was sitting on the beam above him, hammer in hand. He reached up to pass her the nail, and their fingers brushed. Both of them froze. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. The sunlight was in his eyes and sawdust was in his hair, and he kissed her before either of them could think about whether it was a good idea. Quick, almost accidental, like a reflex he could not stop. He stepped back immediately. "Sorry," he said. "I should not have." Delilah grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him back. "Do not you dare apologize," she said, and kissed him properly. He tasted like sawdust and coffee. She tasted like the peppermint candy she kept in her apron pocket and thought nobody knew about. They did not get much more roofing done that afternoon. Another memory. 2 years into the marriage, middle of the night, Zachary screaming in his sleep, thrashing, fighting something that was not there. Delilah held him down, took an elbow to the chin that would leave a bruise, and did not let go. He woke wild-eyed and ashamed, already reaching for his boots. "I will sleep in the barn," he said. "You should not have to deal with this." "You think I do not have nightmares," Delilah said. "I hear gunfire every night. I smell the stable burning. At least now when I wake up, I do not have to hear it alone." He stopped reaching for his boots. She pulled the quilt over both of them. Neither of them slept. They just lay there in the dark with their hands touching. And somehow that was better than sleeping. And one more. An ordinary Tuesday morning. Zachary was feeding the horses. Delilah walked past carrying a bucket of milk from the cow. "Marry me," Zachary said without looking up from the feed bin. Delilah stopped walking. "You asking me or the horse?" He looked up. There was nothing casual in his eyes at all. Nothing casual in the set of his jaw or the way his hands had gone still on the feed bucket. "If the horse says yes first, do I still have a chance?" She set down the bucket, walked over, took his face in both hands, rough hands, calloused, scarred from the fire and from the stitching, and from a decade of building and rebuilding. "I have been waiting 4 months for you to ask, Donovan." They got married 3 weeks later in the Sloan church with half the valley in attendance. Tommy Fletcher stood as best man and cried harder than the bride. The afternoon wound down and Delilah closed the store early. The family walked up the hillside to visit the graves, the path worn smooth by a decade of their footsteps. Thomas ran ahead, as he always did. Sarah rode on Copper, who was old now, gray around the muzzle and slow on the hills. But she carried the little girl with the same steady patience she had once carried her mother into battle. Zachary and Delilah walked side by side, hands intertwined. Both hands bore scars. His from the explosion, hers from the fire on the rock ledge, from stitching his wound, from building fences and breaking horses and 10 years of work that had turned a struggling ranch into something that would endure. At the graves, Delilah knelt to brush leaves from her father's headstone. She noticed, as she did every time, the old bullet hole in the cottonwood trunk behind the grave. 10 years of growth in the tree had nearly swallowed the slug, the bark curling around the wound, absorbing it into the living wood. The scar was still there if you knew where to look, but the tree had grown around it and kept growing, stronger for the healing. Maybe people worked the same way, Delilah thought. The scars did not disappear, they just became part of what held you up. Zachary reached into his vest pocket and produced something small. A single 44-40 cartridge tarnished with age, the brass gone dark, the lead tip dull. He held it in his palm the way Garrett had once held a child's shoe, with the weight of everything it represented. "I kept one," he said, "from those 3 boxes. Carried it for 10 years. "Why?" Delilah said. "To remind myself that sometimes the smallest thing changes everything. One bullet, one decision, one time walking out of a store instead of riding away." Delilah took the cartridge from his hand, turned it in her fingers, felt the weight of it, so small, so ordinary, and so impossibly heavy with everything it had set in motion. She placed it on her father's headstone next to the small bunch of wildflowers that Thomas had picked on the way up. "For Papa," she said. "He always said never waste a round. But I think this one did its job." Thomas came running up the hill, face streaked with mud, grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. "Mama, Papa." Sarah caught a frog. Zachary laughed. It was a sound that Delilah never tired of hearing, easy and full and warm, the kind of laugh that a man has when he has stopped running from himself and finally found the place where he belongs. He scooped Thomas up with one arm and reached for Delilah with the other. She leaned into him, breathed in the scent of him. Leather and horse and the cedar soap he favored, and underneath all of it something warm and steady that she had come to understand was simply home. The Nevada wind moved through the valley carrying sage and dry grass, and the distant sound of Sarah squealing over a frog, and the lowing of cattle in the far pasture, and the creek murmuring its endless story to the rocks. And Delilah Ashford Donovan knew, not with hope, but with the bone-deep certainty of 10 years' proof, that there are things no one can take. Not with guns, not with fire, not with forged papers or hired men or all the money the railroad could offer. Things built by hand, held by blood, and passed down with love. She looked at the man beside her, at the children running through the grass, at the land 3 generations of Ashfords and one stubborn Donovan had fought to keep, and she knew it would stand.